in this off-stream vintage challenge, I was able to get second place with a deck you probably wouldn't expect. All right, welcome back, vintage gamers, to a special little one-game review session of a vintage challenge that I actually got second place in on Friday night. So I took a little night off, but took a night off of making vintage content by playing vintage. So you know how that's going. But I played some Dredge in the Friday challenge off stream, and I have at least one match to show from this second place vintage finish. I actually got second place, losing to Unlucky Mucky twice on his way to his back-to-back vintage challenge wins. Now has 5 vintage challenge wins recently. Pretty crazy. So I went 6-3, got second place with this Dredge list. This is just Lord Beerus Dredge. I just took it, copy-pasted, and tapped BAZAAR of Baghdad. The deck felt very strong. It was quite hard for opponents to interact with you. I think Dredge is at a really good spot in the metagame cycle. I've been saying so on my Patreon for a little while now, but people are not respecting Dredge in deck building. People have very few sideboard cards for Dredge, and it's opening up a pretty big hole where you can really exploit what people are doing with this deck. So I wanted to take this video to just go over one of the games specifically that I thought was interesting. I didn't end up recording the whole challenge. It was supposed to be more of an off-stream chill endeavor. And so I kept forgetting to turn on the recording. But in the quarterfinals, I had one match versus O'Daniel, who is a very powerful MTGO grinder. And I wanted to show it to you because I thought it was interesting and maybe get a little bit of Dredge content on the channel. You don't get that very often. So here we go. We're going to have a recording here. This is game 3 of the quarterfinals versus Blue-Black Lurrus Control. And so I have obviously a 7 that we're not keeping because we don't have BAZAAR of Baghdad. And then I wonder what the best way to do this is. Just a little, yeah. And then we go and we mulligan here and we mulligan to this 6. Keeping the 6, we have a BAZAAR and we have Hollow One, which is great. And then we have some amount of interaction and a small amount of dredging. So not the strongest hand, but a pretty reasonable one. I bought him Serum Powder. I think it's better to have the Creeping Chill in case I draw a Grief and I want to pitch the Chill to the Grief rather than having the Grief still Chill in my deck as the last card to maybe hit them in a longer game. So yeah, I keep this hand on 6, I should say. My opponent kept a 7-card Blue-Black Lurrus draw with a turn 1 Lantern. So we have Lantern on turn 1. Move to our turn. We draw Force of Vigor. And so now I have some decision points here. When do I want to activate this BAZAAR? Do I want to use my Force of Vigor on this Lantern to get them to use the Lantern? Lots of different ways and timing windows where this BAZAAR can be activated. I think I choose to play a Hollow One. Playing a Hollow One on turn 1 is pretty strong, and I have some cards I can pitch and that I don't mind getting rid of to Lantern anyways. So I'm going to say I probably play a Hollow One here after activating BAZAAR. So we play BAZAAR, we activate BAZAAR, and then I have another Dredger, Big Dredger, and an Icarid. So then you have another choice here on what do I want to put into my yard that is likely going to warrant a Lantern. Now, I want to put enough cards in my yard where it's still going to be good, but I also don't want to put too good of cards in my yard that I'm going to lose them to Lantern, especially if I'm thinking about Vigoring this Lantern. And actually right now, I don't think I'm thinking about Vigoring the Lantern. I think I would like to try to push through the Lantern with just good Dredgers. And I think I want to keep the Shambling Shell, so I have a pitch to Vigor, and I can hold up Noxious Revival. So let's see what I end up doing here. I think there's some reasonable choices, but I'm going to go with a full graveyard pitch of Icarid, Imp, and Amalgam with the idea that I want my opponent to just use the Lantern without having to use my Vigor. But that ends up being kind of a hard sell because my opponent does find or have a Wasteland. So now that my opponent Wastelands my BAZAAR of Baghdad, what is our response here? I could let this go, but that turns off my Noxious Revival because they'll still have Lantern. So instead, what I can do is I can Vigor their Lantern, forcing them to wipe the yard, and then Noxious Revivaling my BAZAAR back to my hand. It's not a huge deal that I have no dredgers in my yard because I'm going to have to draw the Bazaar naturally anyways. But it is kind of a bad sequence because I put all of my good cards in my yard. If I had instead maybe held back a card, I could have been in a much better spot. So it's possible here that I was supposed to pitch chill and keep the Stinkweed Imp and show my opponent no dredgers if my plan was to Vigor. However, we don't even know Vigor is going to resolve. So if I like play a Vigor and it gets countered, then there's a whole nother problem. So I'm not saying that the plays I made in this game were correct. I'm just going to show you them as there is. And probably they're not very good. I don't believe I played this tournament very well, but Dredge is so powerful, it doesn't matter too much. So I do elect to go for the Vigor, pitching the Shambling Shell, and forcing the Lantern activation. The Lantern activation gets to go off, and then I get to Noxious Revival my Bazaar. I don't think it matters when I choose to Noxious Revival here. Probably do it at the end of the turn, but I don't think it matters much because if they play a Sapphire or something to get more counter magic, I can just cast it in response. So at the end of the turn, I Noxious Revival back my Bazaar of Baghdad, which also resolves, and we go to this turn where I draw my Bazaar. I then attack with the Hollow One, and then I probably activate Bazaar. Ooh, do I not activate it? I was gonna say I probably activate Bazaar now so that my opponent can't have land Bowmaster. And it looks like I don't do that. So I think that's a little bit of a mistake right there. You want to activate right now because it's not going to ever draw you cards, and you want to play around Bowmaster. But it's also worth noting that doing that now means a second Lantern would be able to hit the card that you put in the yard. So there are positives and negatives to when you choose to use this Bazaar. I think I'd rather play around Bowmaster in this spot, though. My opponent plays a Bauble, checks their top card, and then has a second Wasteland. So I have Wasteland on my Bazaar. I'll activate my thing, and I do luckily hit a Dredger. So now I have a Dredge 5 in my yard. And my opponent draws for Bauble. I Dredge 5, and I hit Creeping Chill, Icarid, Stinkweed Imp, Grief, Prized Amalgam. Really, really strong Dredge. Like one of the best possible Dredges. My opponent gets taken down to 9 with the Hollow One, and then casts an end of turn Brainstorm. Untaps with a fetch land, and then fetches and Time Walks. Time Walk turn comes around, and no land drop plays a frog holding 4 cards in hand. Notably, 4 cards means plenty of cards to pitch and block the Hollow One. And the game gets really interesting from here, too. So I'm going to Icarid, eating the Grief, so I can bring back my Prized Amalgam. And then dredging with my Stinkweed Imp, I dredge 2 Narcomoebas into play. But I don't hit any more dredgers. So I'm out of dredgers. I have an Icarid and Amalgam, 2 Narcomoebas, but nothing else to bring back. So now I'm looking at this. I have an Icarid in play. I'm pretty much out of gas. I have no way to buy the Icarid back again anyways. So what I do is I attack into the frog. If my opponent wants to pitch cards to block and kill this Hollow One, I think that is something that I'm okay with. So my opponent does block with the frog, and my opponent pitches some very important things. So they pitch Underground Sea, they pitch Mox Jet, they pitch Strip Mine. So that kills my Hollow One, and they take 3 down to 5, and then the Prized Amalgam comes back at the end of turn. So now I have an Amalgam, 2 Narcomoebas, and an Icarid that can't bring anything back right now. My opponent attacks with the frog, which is, I think, pretty aggressive. But it signals that they have a second frog. So if I were to block with my Narcomoeba here, I would keep my opponent off of a card, but I would really hamper my chances of attacking and winning. So I let this frog come through after a pretty long think about it. I'm still cycling through here, and I let this frog come through for damage. They follow this up with a frog. And so now there are 2 frogs, 2 cards in my opponent's hand. Notably, 2 cards in my opponent's hand means they can pitch both cards to frog and block this Amalgam. But also, they can jump this frog and block these Narcomoebas. So I just draw a card naturally. It doesn't do anything. I can't return my Icarid because there's no black creatures. And I have to choose whether or not I'm going to attack. And I am. I'm going to attack here. My opponent's at 5. I need to get them low enough where I can, like, Creeping Chill them out or something like that. So I'm going to come in with these Narcomoebas. My opponent is going to block with Frog here on the Amalgam and pitch 2 cards to make it big enough. So my opponent pitches Underground Sea Time Twister. I think that makes a lot of sense. You don't really want Twister from this spot. It could really put me in a good spot if I were to hit another BAZAAR hand. But it does mean they are completely out of cards, and my Amalgam is going to die. They're going to go to 3, but notably, the Amalgam dying means I do have a black creature that Icarid can come back with. That's very important from this spot. So my opponent is at 3. They have 2 frogs on 4 and 3 and have 1 card in hand. They can't attack with both frogs because then the Icarid will kill them. So they're going to attack with 1 frog, the larger frog. This frog comes in, it draws them a wasteland, and they buy Lurrus. And then comes a very interesting top deck. So this Icarid is in my yard, and I'm going to elect to bring this Icarid back. And the reason I'm going to bring it back is because if I attack and they block the Icarid, and these 2 Narcomoebas come in, it puts them to 1, and they can no longer fetch, and they can no longer force. And any Narcomoeba hit is lethal. So I'm going to bring back the Icarid, eating the prize Amalgam, and I'm going to draw Creeping Chill. That's going to come into play later as well. I don't draw the good card this turn, so I do need to fade a Lurrus turn. My opponent goes to 1, and I have to fade a Lurrus here. And my opponent can't attack with any of these frogs unless they draw another frog, because any Narcomoeba hit kills them. So my opponent has a Tormod's Crypt, but I don't actually have anything yet in my yard besides this Icarid. So they have to hold back on these frogs. Icarid can't come back, and I draw Wasteland. This is a crazy good draw, because if you look at what my opponent has discarded to Psychic Frog, they have discarded Underground Sea, Mox Jet, Underground Sea. So if I Wasteland this Underground Sea, that leaves them with, and they can't fetch, that leaves them with very few ways to get the Lurrus into play to close this game out. So I drew a really nice Wasteland here on the second draw, and my opponent is now stuck. We're both stuck. I can't attack because I lose both my things, and they can't attack because they would die. So now my opponent passes back. I draw, pass back. My opponent draws, passes back. I draw, pass back. My opponent draws, passes back. I draw, 7 cards in my hand, pass back. Opponent draws, passes back. And we go to my turn where I get to pitch an 8th card to hand size. So if I pitch a black creature here, then my Icarid can come into play and win the game on the next attack. However, there is a Tormod's Crypt in play. So I pitch to hand size. My opponent does not have the mana to cast any relevant spells in their deck still, and has to pass back. With the Icarid on the stack, my opponent exiles my yard, and I once again have nothing in my yard. Draw for turn. I draw Creeping Chill. Now that's very important here, because I have 2 Creeping Chills in my hand, and I pitch the Golgari Grave Pearl to hand size. At some point, I'm going to bring up my Exile Zone. Right here. And if you look at my Exile Zone, I have 2 Creeping Chills in exile. So now that I have 2 Creeping Chills in exile and 2 Creeping Chills in my hand, I actually have no Creeping Chills that I can hit off this Golgari Grave Troll to kill my opponent. However, they don't know that I have 2 Creeping Chills in my hand. They only know that there are 2 Creeping Chills left in my deck. And they need to make a play before this Golgari Grave Troll wins the game if it hits a Creeping Chill. So they go in the tank for a really long time here. And then they end up with attack all. And this is something I haven't brought up, but for the past 2 or 3 turns, if my opponent was ever to attack all, I have to block 1 because they have 8 cards in hand, and pitching cards to their frogs will lethal me from 13. So I have to block 1 no matter what. But this does mean that this card has to save them, because if they don't draw a card that saves them, they are going to die to Narcomoeba on the swing back. They end up pitching a frog that they couldn't ever cast that would definitely win the game. But they don't have any more black sources to draw because they don't have the ability to fetch, and they threw away too many Underground Seas. And it ends up being my opponent does not find a thing to draw, and my Narcomoeba attacks in and wins this game. I did not have access to Creeping Chills, which my opponent didn't know about, but I did hit like Icarid black creature here. So if my opponent had waited another turn, they could still wait another turn, but they were super worried about getting chilled. 30 cards, Dredge 6. So this is how I ended up winning the quarterfinals with a Narcomoeba attack for 1 on turn 14. Which I thought was probably the single most interesting game of the entire tournament. So I was kind of glad that this one, for some reason, was recorded, where all the other ones weren't. And so, yeah, sometimes Dredge does put together some really cool games. I was talking to my opponent a little bit after this match, because they felt like they made a lot of choice. They are the one who made a lot of choices in this match, and they felt like they made a lot of choices incorrectly. I do think that the wasteland off the top was just a crazy good hit, because if I don't hit a wasteland, they're just like casting a third frog and beating me. So like a lot of things had to go completely right for me to win this match. But sometimes they do. And that's kind of how the whole tournament went. Some things like that happened in lots of rounds. I think there was a round with Jewel where my opponent drew like 10 cards and bricked. So you gotta get a little lucky to win or get in the finals of a Magic tournament. But I'm glad I recorded this, because I think it was probably the single most interesting game of the entire tournament. And I would go on to lose game 3 of the finals to Unlucky Monkey and get a nice second place with a deck that I'm not very good with in Dredge. Let me know in the comments if you thought that this video was good and helpful, or if you thought that you would rather just see every match get played out. Definitely want to experiment with different types of content and see what people enjoy. More full vintage gameplay videos on the YouTube channel every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I'll see you then.